It's a shame that we didn't interview more people that were here during the 1918 flu, but we interviewed people as far back as the turn of the 20th century. But there was Doug Boyd was telling me yesterday he'd been looking through the collection for flu excerpts, and he found an interview I did with Alta Mae Chandler, and she was here during 1918, but she didn't have much to say about it. And she said, "I'm surprised you haven't talked to a lot more people." And I didn't want to tell her it was, even back then, it was hard to find people that had been here in 1918.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me just start this off by saying thank you to everyone for joining us on this special edition of the Behind the Blue podcast. I'm Cody Kaiser from UK Public Relations and Strategic Communications. I'm joined by my colleague, Carl Nathy. And our guest today on the podcast is Terry Birdwhistell. Terry Birdwhistell is the senior oral historian in the Louie B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries, and has contributed to numerous collections, including the Encyclopedia of Louisville and the Kentucky Encyclopedia. And you've had articles appearing in publications far and wide, ranging from Kentucky Law Journal, Register of Kentucky Historical Society, Kentucky Review, and many, many more. So thank you for being with us this morning in this in our odd new normal of circumstances.
Glad to be here.
The first thing that I'd like for you to do is, and one of the kind of the crux of this, what we're really wanting to talk about is kind of a comparison, a parallel of where we are right now, comparing where campus was and where the university was during the 1918 flu pandemic. The first thing that I'd like for you to do is to tell us, if you're a person from today who had a chance to go back in time, it's 1918, you're stepping onto the campus of the University of Kentucky, paint a mental image of what that looks like. How does campus appear compared to today?
Well, that's an excellent question, Cody. I think the first thing you'd have to keep in mind is how small the university was at that time. It was like 1,200 students. It'd be like walking onto the Center College campus. And so that's the first thing that would strike you. The other thing that you would immediately notice in 1918 are the number of military people on campus, young soldiers. We had hundreds of soldiers on campus taking educational courses and training, to prepare for their entry into World War I. And so what was happening at UK in the fall of 1918, you had a relatively new president, Frank McVeigh, who had been here less than a year. You had a world war raging in Europe with the United States entering that war and mobilization, causing loss of enrollment because of young men at UK going back to work on the farms to support the war effort or going into the service. And as I said, then you had hundreds of young military men on the campus. They were camped over at what is now the Red Mile. They set up their barracks over there, and they were taking classes and training here at the University of Kentucky.
What was as far as a number, what was the enrollment size of the university at that time?
That's about 1,200.
And we did have women on campus as well who were staying at Patterson Hall. That's right.
There were women in Patterson Hall and also a women's dorm called Maxwell Hall. And once the flu outbreak came, some of the students left immediately. And at the height of the pandemic on campus, there were only about 20 women students who remained in Patterson Hall. The way they did it, the university, much like with this pandemic today, the university reacted to it in stages. at first tried to quarantine those students who were getting ill. And then eventually they told the students who were not living on campus, but were living out in the community that they couldn't come back to campus. And then eventually, of course, as it worsened in early October, they just stopped all classes. And that lasted for about 5 weeks. But the interesting comparison to 1918 for me is that the first case was reported in Louisville that fall. And then it just really took off, just like the one this year. But A.O. Stanley was governor of Kentucky at the time, but his name doesn't come up very much. It's the Kentucky Board of Health that sends out a proclamation that everything is closed. And they closed all entertainment. They told people not to travel. They told people not to go to funerals. And they told people not to go to church. And, you think of the reaction in 2020 to that order, and you would think it would be even more difficult to put out an order like that in 1918. The other difference is I was talking to a young person the other day, and they were asking me about the 1918 flu, and I said, one of the things you have to remember, there was no television, obviously no internet, there wasn't even any radio. Mm-hmm. So, the people who were quarantined, they had much fewer options to entertain themselves or to communicate with people in their families back home or anyone really, other than what you could read in local newspapers. And local newspapers that I've surveyed often printed the names of UK students who were home recovering from the flu in their hometowns.
Terry, this is Carl. I just wanted to ask you regarding the 1918 so-called Spanish flu, which is interesting in itself that it really didn't originate in Spain. I'd like you to talk about that for a moment. But also, not only were classes suspended for 5 weeks, as you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, for those sports fans out there, and I realize sports and athletics is not necessarily the center of people's lives, or should it be? However, it is a great diversion for a lot of people. And sports, particularly football, in the fall of 1918, that was impacted by the flu epidemic.
It certainly was. UK ended with a record of 2-1 that fall. They defeated Indiana and Georgetown, but lost to Vanderbilt. A couple of interesting things regarding that. We were scheduled to play Center College, and the game was canceled. And the press reports were that the people at Center were very upset about that game being canceled because they thought that was a year they could beat UK. And then the other news on the football side was that the traditional Thanksgiving game was canceled, and that was a pretty big event back then, and it didn't happen. And the newspaper said that people could now enjoy Thanksgiving without being worried about what happened to the football game. But yes, that was a very important part of the whole quarantine and cancellations.
I think that article said something about families could now enjoy Thanksgiving in more of a Puritan fashion. I think it alluded to the Puritan lifestyle.
That's probably true. But I particularly liked the reports from Center that they thought that was their year and they didn't get a chance to whip up on UK.
What about the Spanish flu? Tell us a little bit why it was called that, even though that was kind of unfair.
Well, I'll leave that to the medical experts and the people who cover pandemics about why that happened. I think what I've read had to do in part with what was going on with the war in Europe and the outbreaks in Spain. And
I understand there was also some, at least a lot of reports about censorship that was going on in the world at that time. And ironically, Spain's press was more free to report about it even, I guess, than the American press, from what I've read.
Yeah, I haven't read those. I know there was, of course, a lot of coverage of the flu, both as I said, in newspapers all over the state. And, back then, even small towns had 2 newspapers sometimes. And then the colonel covered it very well too at the time, as they often do.
Well, as you pointed out, we had just entered as far as manpower sending troops. We just entered World War I. From 1917, I believe the U.S. had been sending money and supplies, but now we're starting to send soldiers to the Western Front starting in that summer of 1918. In a lot of the photos that I've looked at on our campus, I've seen in the archives, a lot of military training photos, a lot of photos in front of Buell Armory. Right. Did that exist to some degree before the war, or was that more because of the war?
Well, we had, the university has a long tradition of having a cadet corps and ROTC and those types of things. But what the photos that you're seeing are a result of the Student Army Training Corps that was on campus. Several hundred young men. Some were UK students, to begin with. But that's what you're seeing there, and that resulted from, when Frank McVeigh came here. He had his PhD from Yale. He'd been a professor at the University of Minnesota, president of the University of North Dakota. He was an economist. He was well connected around the country. And so one of the things that he did in terms of trying to help the university was bring these federal programs to the campus. And so it was through his sort of efforts that we were able to secure that. It was called the SATC, Student Army Training Corps, to bring that to campus to keep the enrollment up, basically, and keep people employed and keep things going. And then President McVeigh played a leading role statewide in organizing things for the military and the federal government. So he was well connected into all of that. And you can just imagine what was going through his mind, coming here in this early time of his presidency and dealing with, the beginning of a world war and the outbreak of a pandemic all at the same time. And a historically underfunded college. Right.
It's interesting too. I think in some degrees the parallels there of a university president like President McVeigh, who, like you were saying, had those federal connections, had that kind of economics background to be able to respond to this. And you compare it to now when we have a university president who has a background in public health, who Absolutely. Is very mindful of the steps that we need to take in that regard. And I think it's one of those things where it's not serendipity, but very fortuitous that we have those people in those positions at those times.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I had given that some thought, how those things work out, to have somebody with President Capelouto's qualifications leading the university at this point. I've had some communication with the president about the history of UK on and off, and he was very interested in, as he stated in his broadcast the other day, about the 1918 flu. And, when you think about the two things that we're challenged with right now, with public health and what's going to happen with the economy, I think having President Capelouto and Dr. Eric Monday together as a team working with us, not to slight the people out at the at UK Healthcare who are doing such a tremendous job. We're very fortunate to have that. When President McVeigh, after the flu started to subside, they were doing sort of after action reports, and he was giving the numbers of people on campus who had been impacted. There were several hundred cases on campus of the flu. I think 8 deaths of the flu. And after he gave his report, a member of the board of trustees, a member of the board said, "Don't you think we need a hospital? We need a hospital on this campus." And of course, they set up a hospital and infirmary in Buell Armory. But I think everybody agreed in 1918 that it would be great for UK to have some of that expertise, but obviously it was many years later in the 1960s when that finally came to pass. So sometimes in higher education, you have to be persistent and patient because things take a while to happen.
If I might interject here, Terry, you mentioned the impact directly on campus, but the first case was found in Louisville, and this did impact the Commonwealth as a whole, our nation as a whole, and the world. This was a true pandemic, 1918.
Oh, there's no question about it. And, I told a personal story about the impact on my family. I don't know if you all saw that, where, my grandparents lived far out into the countryside over in Anderson County, and my grandmother got the flu over there and lost a child. And so, this was something that impacted everyone's life. And, I made a note in looking through this. Today we hear about the number of deaths in New York and around the country. What you have to do is think about, well, that would fill Rupp Arena. And you have to think about the whole Rupp Arena full of people, and those people then suffer from this pandemic. Well, back in 1918, I tried to put a face on some of these deaths here at UK. One was Private Harry K. Smith, who was a 20-year-old member of the Student Army Training Corps. He was from Springfield, Kentucky, and he was here studying engineering. And so he was going to take his engineering training into the military service. Second person was Private G. Lloyd Hayden, only 18 years old, a member of the Corps. And he was a student whose brother had captained the UK football. So, when you look back at 1918, it almost seems abstract in a way. These are just numbers. These are just things happening, but when you start to look into the individuals and the ripple effect on their families, across the Commonwealth. And as you said, it was many, many deaths and illnesses across Kentucky at that time. And so that, it had a huge impact. Now, the difference I'm seeing between 1918 and today is that once it peaked in November of 1918 and sort of through December, things returned back to normal fairly quickly, it seems like. When they got back to campus in the spring, after they had reopened, they made concessions for the seniors that, in terms of the number of hours they would have to have completed to graduate. They were trying to make sure that people could graduate even though their fall semester had been disrupted. The commencement was delayed about a month, but they still had the commencement. And then things sort of returned to normal, seemingly rather quickly. Whereas in our situation today, we're unsure about the summer, we're unsure about the fall, and we're unsure about the financial implications that all of this is going to have. And so in thinking about the comparison between then and now, this seems to me to be much more serious in terms of how it's going to change how we do things. And I think it'll change UK far more than the 1918 epidemic did.
Well, you mentioned something. You were talking about the number of deaths on campus, and it seems like a small number. What I find interesting, the differences between now and 1918, is that the 1918 influenza disproportionately affected people in the 20 to 40 age range. It really was hard on young adults. And to see low numbers like that kind of here are kind of surprising in some way.
It does surprise people, but you have to remember how many fewer people there were. In Fayette County in 1918, there were just over 41,000 people. We have almost that many students on campus. And so in Fayette County, they had a 1,000, cases of the flu out of 41,000. So, and when President McVeigh did his report to the board after it all started to subside, he did make note that the percentages of deaths versus cases was much lower at UK than out in the community and statewide. And so part of that, I think he was trying to make the case that the caregiving at UK was pretty good. And I did find that interesting in terms of how they set up that hospital in Buell Armory. They turned over the operation of the infirmary to the Lexington chapter of the American Red Cross. And there were mostly women who were running that. Mrs. W.H. Thompson was in charge of the nurses, and she had been in charge of nurses at Good Samaritan Hospital prior to that. And the head nurse was Catherine O'Brien, Miss Catherine O'Brien. And there were 10 women helping them with the nursing. And two of the nurses were nuns from St. Catherine's. And so I think one of the unappreciated stories out of 1918 and of 2020 is the role of women in these types of pandemics and putting their own health and lives on the line to help mostly men patients. There was a professor on campus named J.W. Pryor. He was a professor of anatomy and physiology, and he was sort of overlooking the whole thing. Of course, you had to have a man over the whole thing, and so he was the guy who did that. And then he had two men helping him who were with the Army Corps, and that was Captain Mills and Lieutenant Fletcher. And the board reported that they showed good judgment and resourcefulness. So, but I think the role of the women is very important. And also, when they had the infirmary set up, they had to figure out how to feed the patients and feed the people who were there. And so they had cooks and kitchens going on there. And they also had food supplies being brought in from the community. They brought milk and apples and different types of food given to the infirmary to help feed the patients.
Terry, this is Dr. Terry Birdwhistell's our guest on this interview. I'm Carl Nathy, along with Cody Kaiser of UK Public Relations and Strategic Communications. But Terry, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your life as a student of history, you studied it undergraduate, you have 2 advanced degrees, including your PhD at the University of Kentucky. You've devoted your life to oral history. I've talked to historians at UK and elsewhere. Sometimes the phrase comes up, the past is prologue. In other words, sometimes in the modern age, we think, oh, well, this is the first time any of this kind of stuff's ever happened. As witness history, we had something similar in 1918. Probably, I hate to say it, 100 years from now, there'll probably be something else we're dealing with. History, it's important to learn history and to understand it. And that's one of the things that you've devoted your life to.
Yes. One of my professors in graduate school, Dr. George Herring, he always liked the quote that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so there are similarities. 2 years ago in 2018, there was a spike in flu cases in the state of Kentucky and, around Kentucky. And I do a blog about UK history. And I actually wrote in my blog 2 years ago about the 1918 flu and how it compared to the flu spike in 2018, never thinking that, we'd have something as devastating as the COVID-19, which really, I think, as we look closer at 1918, and I've mentioned previously, it really far exceeds what happened in 1918 as we see the changes going on in our society right now. And really, everybody wondering how many students will come back to campus, how will the state budget survive this, how will we get through this, and then that again goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the leadership and how important it is to have great leadership at UK right now, because this might be the biggest challenge we face so far.
I do think it is important in that light to point out too that things can seem dire or desperate, but it is a lesson that we can take from past situations where we look at those situations, we realize how hard things were, and we see that people persevered. People were resourceful, they had strong leadership, and they were able to find a way through in order to persevere through those situations. And I think that's important, that people keep hope up and understand that we will get through this.
Absolutely. And what I hope, and I know many people hope, is that we'll reevaluate how we structure our society and how we reward people for work. Because one of the things we've learned through this pandemic is that the people we pay the least, we depend on the most. And, I'd like to see our society take a close look at how we treat people who we depend on so much. And those are the people that are getting hurt the most, obviously. And they're the ones putting themselves on the front lines. You're right, Cody, in terms of thinking. Things can always be dealt with. And, I was mentioning earlier about no radio, no TV, no internet. And these young women who were quarantined in Patterson Hall, there's some stories in the Kernel about what they were doing during, they couldn't go out. And so it said the girls knitted, played cards, danced, took long hikes, read countless books, and sang until they lost their voices, and played many games. And so, it puts a kind of a human face on this, those young women dealing with this, locked up basically in Patterson Hall, which fortunately still exists today. Another little thing that happened was Frances Jewell, who at that time was an instructor in English at UK, but would eventually marry Frank McVeigh, the president, and become Frances Jewell McVeigh, probably one of the most well-known and highly regarded women in the history of UK. Well, as a young English professor, she went over to Patterson Hall and had the girls who lived in Patterson Hall picked up, and she took them out into the countryside for a weenie roast, and then brought them back to her home over on Ashland Avenue, where they ate more and sang songs. And so, again, it's, you're thinking about if you could go back to 1918, well, it would seem in that sense a lot like today, people like us dealing with these challenges and trying to make the best of it and get through it. And I think you're right. I think with our leadership at UK, we're going to get through this. We're going to come out with some ideas about how to improve what we do and make some good changes.
You talked about doctors and nurses from the Red Cross who headed up the efforts at Buell Armory, where they turned it into an infirmary. And you've pointed out some newspaper articles, things like that. Do we have other existing material that help fill this story out? Journals, letters, things like that?
There would be in the individual collections that are in our Special Collections Research Center. There would be materials that one could find. One of the frustrating things in even preparing to talk with you all was that I couldn't get back into the archives and plow through some of those things. But we're very fortunate that the Special Collections Research Center has so much of this online. And I would recommend to people to go to Explore UK and type in flu or 1918, and a lot of these stories will come up. And I have access to newspapers.com through Ancestry, and that's where I found the stories of the newspapers around the state, which are absolutely fascinating to see how individual communities were dealing with it.
Terry, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think might be important to point out or to talk about, maybe in some of how our experiences has kind of helped inform our response from the past, inform our response to this current situation?
Well, first would say that, more Kentuckians died from the 1918 flu than died in World War I. We have Memorial Hall to honor those who died in World War I. So that sort of puts it in some kind of context. And so I think, when we get through this, we need to think back about those people in Kentucky and those people who were connected to our university, how their lives were impacted, and we should do our best to sort of document that. I know Dr. Doug Boyd in the Louie B. Nunn Center for Oral History is working with Ruth Bryan, the University Archivist, and Deirdre Skaggs, the Associate Dean for Special Collections, and we're trying to come up with some ways to document what's going on today. And they're actually looking at some technology similar to what we're using today that would allow people to submit their individual stories about how this impacted their life. And so we're hoping that we'll gather stories from UK alums from around the country or even around the world, and also from our students and our staff and our faculty. And I'm particularly interested in gathering stories from our 2020 graduates, because their lives were turned upside down with this, and they lost that experience of their spring semester of their senior year commencement. It reminded me of what happened after the Kent State episode in 1970, that there was no commencement, and those students never really got over missing out on that. Now, in the large scale of looking at the pandemic, that might be small, but we're interested in people's individual lives and how that was impacted. And I think students of UK history and Kentucky history 100 years from now will find that fascinating. And if we can capture those voices and save the voices, that would be terrific. And I'm looking forward to hearing how my colleagues in the special collections are going to pull that off. And I appreciate what you all are doing to keep everybody informed and to do these types of programs to give people a better sense of how we got to where we are today, and how that things in the past really did impact us. And I'll just say again, I think the university is very fortunate with the leadership we have across the board right now. We were very fortunate we had Frank McVeigh in 1918, and certainly very fortunate to have Eli Capilouto and Eric Monday, the team of excellent people in UK healthcare, not to mention UK public relations. Some of my favorite people on campus.
Well, Terry, we want to thank you very much for the time that you've taken to be with us today, and the stories that you've been able to share with us and the insight. We greatly appreciate that.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I look forward to the day when we can all get back on campus and get back to work there.
And one last thing, Dr. Terry Birdwhistell, Senior Oral Historian, Louie B. Nunn Center for Oral History, University of Kentucky Libraries. Give that contact point again, Explore UK. How can people do that?
Just go on your computer to exploreuk.uky.edu, and it'll take you right there, and it'll open up a whole avenue of exploring history. It has you can access all the Kentucky kernels from the beginning, all the UK yearbooks, different types of collections, photographs. The photographs that people may have seen about the 1918 flu on UK's campus can be found there on Explore UK, and they can really search for themselves some of those documents.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Excellent stuff. We hope that people do go and check that out. Again, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.